Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I've got a special treat. This is going to be a long video, but I'm going to walk you through every step of the process of restoring this pocket watch to almost looking new. Obviously there's some things that we won't be able to do, but we're going to cover removing the jewels. We're going to go through cleaning everything. We're going to cover getting the watch redone. I'm trying to save as much money for this client as possible because they don't want to do a complete full restoration, which would involve gold plating the case and changing the mainspring and all that. But we're going to do a really good job of getting this watch running almost perfectly. So let's get started with this. Here you can see we've got this old Waltham pocket watch. It's a size 18. It's in mechanically okay shape. It's got some damage to the case. The watch was pretty well loved during its existence. It's about 100 years old, and you can see here on the bezel, it took me a while to get this off. We've got some damage to the bezel, and it's kind of keeping that pressure on the watch bezel so that it's very difficult to put on and take off. So we're going to remove that dent in there. We're going to get a new crystal. By the way, I have literally thousands of old pocket watch crystals, brand new old stock, that I have collected over the years. We're going to take a look at the back cover here. You can see it's got some brassing on it. Brassing is where the wear over the years has taken the gold off of the watch and exposed the brass material in between the layers of gold. So this is a warranted case. Obviously, it's gold filled. And you can see we don't have a broken balance staff, which is good. I'm going to check all the jewels, though, because we don't know if the watch has ever been dropped. Judging by the damage, I expected to find quite a bit of problems with the watch. Luckily, I was in luck. We have a broken case screw, so we're going to have to get that out. We've got one case screw that's still holding the movement in the case. Let's get that out now. Now, I use trays to hold my parts in. There's several different varieties of parts trays. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to get some of those trays. And I'll show you the tweezers and screwdrivers, also links for those. If those of you who want to start working on watches yourself can collect some tools that you're going to need to do this particular amount of work. Here you can see we're taking the watch movement apart. I've removed the plate and we're just kind of taking the gears out and examining each of them as we take them out of the watch movement. It's always a good idea to take a look at what's going on with the watch before you go ahead and clean the parts. If you have any damage, it's a good time to start fixing it. And here's the winding and setting system. This clutch system works pretty good. It's been used in Elgin, Howard, Waltham, Illinois pocket watches. It's a very common system that's used for many watches over the years. It's changed a variety of ways from the mid 1800s to the early and mid 1900s. There are literally dozens of ways to set and wind these old pocket watches. So here you can see on this particular piece, there's 3 gears that actuate the setting gear, and we're going to remove these out. There's some arbors in there that hold everything in place, and then we have some springs that help align the gears vertically on the watch movement. That's the setting gear we just took out. We're going to put that aside. You can see this watch has a lot of old dried grease on it. Some of those green spots on there are just old grease and oil that's dried up over the years and kind of oxidized the brass on this movement. Here we're going to remove the ratchet. This ratchet bridge holds that ratchet gear in place for the winding of the mainspring barrel. And you don't have to apply too much pressure, but you want to be cautious when you run into screws that are so tight that it takes a lot of pressure to undo them, because you can snap the heads off the screws, especially with watches that are over 100 years old. Let's remove this plate and we'll expose the ratchet wheel. We're going to get that out of the way. And we also have a click spring and a click. This click here, it locks in the ratchet for the mainspring barrel winding. Very simple watches to work on, and anytime anybody asks me about starting to repair watches and learning how to do it, I always say start with old pocket watches, because these pocket watches are larger. You can see how they work. It helps you to learn how to work with these with parts that are easy to handle. Now you can see I'm just tightening up the case screws, or the dial screws rather. These dial screws, there's 3 of them in this particular watch that hold the dial in place. A lot of pocket watches that are 16 size and over will have 3 dial feet. Some of the 12 size, 6 size, 0 size pocket watches from this era will only have 2 dial feet. Now here you can see there's 2 screws holding on the clutch system here. We're going to remove that. This is going to remove the stem that's inside the watch. Actually not the stem, but the insert for the stem. And we'll take these 2 screws out. It will allow us to take the winding system off the watch. Now sometimes they get a little stuck in there. Don't get worried. Just gently poke them through and you can get these screws out. Sometimes you have to give them a little pressure, but for the most part they'll just come out on their own. And we'll get those aside and put them in the tray, and we'll worry about those when we have to clean them. It's also a good time to examine these parts because they come out, and obviously you can see there's 3 pieces that hold this winding system in place. And we're going to just make sure everything is cleaned and working good. There's no damage to those. And here you can see I'm removing the balance off of the balance cock. There's 1 screw typically on these watches that holds the collet for the hairspring. And we're going to remove that, tighten up this screw on the balance cock so that it doesn't get lost. Very gently tighten it up. You don't have to put any pressure on it. You just want to keep it in one position so that when you clean it, it doesn't come out or get lost in the parts tray. Again, we'll examine the balance wheel, make sure that everything's good, and I'll go ahead and clean this separately. There you can see there's our balance jewel, this is the balance system itself. Obviously we've got the staff and the fork jewel there, or not the fork jewel, but the balance jewel that actuates the fork. And here there's typically 2 screws that hold in the balance jewel, and here we're working on the upper balance. And what we want to do is remove these 2 screws. Now on a watch that's 100 years old or older that's been serviced many times, these screws typically get stripped out. And a lot of times we'll replace them and retap that, but you just want to be careful with those. The strip screws won't come out very easy, so you'll have to force those out with screwdriver tips and just poke those through, and you can see that screw comes out on its own relatively easy. A lot of times if a watch is dropped, these are the first jewels to break. So now what we're going to do is pop these jewels out of the balance cock. And these balance jewels are in 2 pieces. There's a cap jewel and a hold jewel, and they are brass set. So these typically have synthetic ruby for the jewels or a synthetic diamond for the jewels, and they were manufactured to the standards for whatever the watch was. Now we're going to worry about the lower jewel set. Again, we've got the same situation. 2 screws holding in that balance set, or that jewel set, and we're going to remove these 2 screws. Again, be very careful. They can strip pretty easy, and you can see here they loosen up pretty good, but I'm pretty sure these have been stripped in the past because they don't really come out all the way. So it's going to take a little work to get these out if I have to force those little screws out. They're holding in the jewel set pretty well, so I'm guessing that I'm not going to have too much of an issue here, but again, you just want to be careful. Again, these can be tapped, and you can put new screws in if you have screw sets. A lot of times if I replace them, I'll use stainless steel screws. We use the originals whenever possible. And very similar to the balance cock, we have a set of jewels, both a cap and a hold jewel, and they are both brass set. So we're going to poke those through. Again, these are synthetic jewels. You can see this one is stuck together, which tells me that when it was stuck together, it was just probably over-oiled, dried up over time. And there is our hole jewel. It's very difficult to see the tiny little hole in there, but it is there. It's not chipped or cracked, so we're in good shape with that. And we also have the cap jewel. We'll take a good look at that under the microscope and make sure that there's no damage to that. Here's the original mainspring. Again, I'm trying to save the customer some money because they don't have a lot of money to put into restoring this watch. You can see we've got a decent mainspring. Looks like it was probably replaced about 40 or 50 years ago, but it does have a little bend in the center of the mainspring. So what we're going to do is take this out. I'm going to reshape the spring. I'm going to temper it and harden it so that it has its tension back. We'll test it and make sure that once it's cleaned and re-oiled, we can put it back in the watch without any problem. Now, when these springs were like $5 or $9, I'd replace them all the time, but now that they're $40, $50, $60, I offer the customer the option to go ahead and we can reuse your old spring in most cases. Some cases we can't. So the smaller the watch, the more likely we're going to have to replace the spring. The larger the watch, we can usually retension the spring and get it nice and stiff so that it runs the watch real good. Again, here we're looking at the mainspring barrel, and we're just going to check for dried oil, any debris in here. This looks relatively clean, so it tells me that this mainspring was replaced, within the last 50 years, and the watch was put aside at some point in time. Here's the damage to the bezel. Now, I have several stainless steel rings that I use to reshape the bezel. I'll eventually get to that. What I want to do here is just kind of bend this up a little bit and get it off from putting any pressure onto the porcelain dial. That way I can also test and see how well it's going to screw down and hold itself in place onto the frame of the case. And this is going to have to be straightened out pretty good when we put the new crystal on. So we'll go ahead and do a test here. The front of the case holds the bezel, and it only goes together pretty much one way. In some cases, you can kind of screw those up, but we're going to go ahead and polish this up. You can see after polishing and cleaning, I'm going to do a quick test. There was a lot of debris on the threads, so it's important to make sure that your threads are nice and clean so that the watch case kind of screws back together relatively easy. Again, these aren't waterproof or water resistant. They're just, cases to, hold your pocket watch. We've cleaned up most of the debris on the case. I've taken off a lot of the surface scratches, and this is about as good as we're going to go with this case. Obviously, we're not going to go ahead and gold plate it since gold's at, $3,300 an ounce. We're not going to go ahead and plate this at all. It's not cost effective. Here's a brand new watch crystal. This is new old stock. And we're just going to go ahead and snap it in place, and I will also put a little adhesive on that so that it holds relatively good. And we're going to clean this up before we do the final assembly, but for the most part, that brand new crystal, new old stock crystal looks really good on this watch. So we'll go ahead and clean all the parts in the ultrasonic cleaners, and once they're out, we're going to go ahead and examine them because we don't want to put anything back together that has any damage that we didn't catch before. So always a good time after you've cleaned the watch parts to go ahead and look at them one by one and just check everything before you assemble everything. So I'm going to start with the jewels here. We're going to work on the lower jewel set. This is for the balance staff. These balance jewels, again, only go in one way. We're going to start with the whole jewel and insert that into the frame. Once the whole jewel is in place, we'll go ahead and put the cap jewel in and then use the 2 screws to hold that down. So I'm just going to try to get this in focus for you. When you take these apart, you'll see how they go together. It's pretty simple. Usually the whole jewel is not keyed, but it has a rim around it, so it fits perfectly with inside the frame for that jewel. And you will see once you get it seated how it looks. Sometimes you got to be a little careful with these and just get them in the right way. And you can see I'm struggling with this particular one. It's a very tight jewel set for this. And once we get it in position, I can kind of push it in place and seat it. It should stay by itself now that it's cleaned. And I'm just putting a little pressure on the brass end to hold it. I'm going to put a drop of oil there. And again, this is the whole jewel. And now we're going to put the cap jewel. And the cap jewel has 2 little indents on the surface where those screws hold it in place. So you're going to line it up and you're going to get that in position. You can twist this a little bit to make sure it's lined up perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and use my tweezers just to make sure it's flush. We've got a little oil in there, so I'm not going to worry about that. And now, since it's lined up good, we'll go ahead and put those 2 screws to hold in the jewels in place. Now on wristwatches today, you'll see that most jewels are pressure set and they don't have screws that hold in. Usually there's a brass frame around the jewel and it'll push or pressure fit into a either stainless or brass frame, and we'll kind of tamper that down and the pressure will hold it in place. With these, because they were bigger, and of course this was engineering back in the 1800s, they typically used steel screws here to hold those jewels down. And for those of you that work on watches or they're watch collectors and avid enthusiasts, you'll know that obviously this is a complete system that's different than how the balanced jewels are put into watches today. Once we get those lower jewels in place, we'll go ahead and look at those under the magnifying glass or the microscope, and we'll just make sure everything's seated correctly. And now I'm going to start putting back the winding system onto this plate. And this is obviously the winding and setting clutch that we're going to put together. And it goes back just like it came out. And we'll get that seated in there. It's always a good idea to put a little oil in these parts to keep them, free moving. It also helps keep debris out. It also makes it easier to wind and set the watch. Now, a lot of times some of these parts, there's no keys that hold them in place. So you have to kind of get everything lined up by eye, make sure that it's seated correctly. And we're going to flip that over while holding it with one finger. And I'm going to try to line it up so that I can put the 2 screws that hold that system in place. And here you can see I'm just using my tweezers to line those up very carefully. You don't want to ruin the threads. And I know a lot of you closet watchmakers out there, the basement watchmakers, are going to say, oh, I'm a hack, because that's what you guys think. But no, once you start doing this for, several decades, you're going to know how to handle these parts. But the internet is full of haters, so we just go ahead and deal with them. Again, we'll put that second screw in, and I'm trying to hold this with one hand, work in front of a camera. So it's a little difficult when you have a camera stuck in front of your face, but we're going to line this up, get that screw down there. I'm not going to tighten this all the way. We're just going to get it mostly tight, and we'll come back and adjust these just to make sure the alignment's correct. It's always a good idea to have a good set of screwdrivers with good sharp blades. Make sure they're flat so that they don't slip on you. Once we've got that done, we're going to go ahead and make sure that the system works good. And here you can see if I put a little pressure on this clutch, it has that little spring in there which actuates the setting and winding system. Now on the reverse side of the inside of the plate, we're going to kind of get this all back together. So I'm going to line this up just to make sure that I've got it in the right place where everything goes. And misaligning it here. There we go. That's how it's supposed to be. There are several gears here. One, that little spring that sticks up right here, this actuates a winding and setting change to the watch. So the little gear that actuates there is kind of pushed up and down with that spring, and we have to make sure that that's lined up and in place. It's a little tricky to do. If you've never done this before, I'll show you here in a minute how it's done. And you can see now what I'm doing is just putting the gears in place. Now it does look dirty, but that's just staining of the brass from the old oil. It's not worth, again, polishing up because the watch is worn. It works really good. We're not going to go ahead and try to make it look perfect on the inside. Again, I'm trying to save the customer a little bit of money. It's getting a little expensive to fix these with the inflation today. So here's that little spring I was talking about. This spring puts a little vertical pressure on a setting gear. So we're going to actually get this in place before we adjust that setting gear. And just make sure that everything looks good. Oh, let's get this one wheel out here. I was just lining it up before. I forgot to take that back out. Now we'll get this plate in, this bridge for our gear system. And if you look closely here, this is the gear I'm talking about that moves vertically, and the spring is actually what pushes it up and down. So we're going to do a little trick here. I'm going to put a little oil on that just to make sure it's lubed up, and we are going to get that gear on there. Let's see if I'm doing it here. And I'm going to use my little driver to hold that spring down. This is where 3 hands come in pretty handy. And we'll seat that gear and try to keep that spring down as tight as possible while we attach this bridge. And once we get this bridge in place, and you can see I'm just kind of wiggling it in place. Now we'll get the arbor in there. We'll line that up. It's keyed. So we'll just line that up until it falls into its seat. Very carefully. There we go. And I'll grab the retaining screw, and we'll put that on. Again, these are all keyed normal threads. There's nothing here has reverse threads on it. And we're just going to tighten this up very carefully. And once that's done, it holds that setting gear in place with that spring so we don't have to worry about it too much. And now everything should work perfectly. We've got one more thing to do here. You can see we can adjust this spring. There's a little tab that we want to get on either side of the pinion. And if I get that lined up good here, my finger's in the way. I don't know why it's giving me a hard time. I think because the camera was in my way. There we go, just like so. And now when we actuate the stem and crown, you'll see that we adjust the position of the setting and winding system, and it'll come back and forth. Good, it's not moving because I have everything seated, pushed in that pad. So that's why I don't like using stiff pads. I really like using foam pads. Now I'm going to go ahead and just tighten up all the screws, make sure that everything's good, and we're going to re-lube everything just to make sure that everything is moving freely. And we'll give it a quick shot here, a quick test. I'm just going to poke my driver in there and just make sure that that moves up and down, and we're good. If anything moves, poorly, it's a good time to go and adjust things. Just double check that you've assembled it correctly. And we're just looking for a nice slippage. Everything works good on this particular watch. Let's go ahead and put the ratchet system back in place. Again, like anything mechanical, this should go together exactly the reverse of how it came apart. We're going to put the click back in, and we're going to seat that click correctly. I'll drop a little oil on it, make sure that the spring is holding that click in position. Should hold the click very tight against the ratchet wheel. And I'm just going to push that spring in, seat this click correctly. Once that's done, you can see it holds the click in the right position. Now we'll grab the ratchet wheel. There's no real reason to lubricate this. Some people do, some people don't. I don't particularly believe that you need to lubricate this. It's not anything that has a great deal of vertical pressure on it. It's only going to just kind of slide along the brass. You'll of course get winding marks on there, but it won't really wear anything out. We'll do the cover plate here for the ratchet wheel. There's one screw that holds this plate in, and it keeps both the click spring and the ratchet seated correctly together. A lot of times on these particular style watches, there'll be a little hole next to the click, and if you push that in, it will release the tension on the spring. So I'm going to go ahead and put that one screw back. Remember, this is not a car engine. You don't have to tighten this down to 500 pounds torque. Some people like to tighten these down so tight that they break the heads. So once you feel that it's seated, you can give it just a little bit of pressure and it should hold in place forever. Now I'm going to use my winding key here, and we're just going to go ahead and make sure that everything works good. When the watch stem is pushed in, it should be in winding mode. If you pull the stem out, it'll be in setting mode, and that's how the whole system works. And again, we're looking at that. It works fine. I'm going to test it from this side just to make sure, and everything is sliding in the proper position. Everything's working, and we can move on. Now, in this case, I've already cleaned the mainspring. I've retempered it, and I've tested the spring tension on it so that it is good. It's not going to be, perfect like a brand new spring, but again, I have to buy these springs for $40, $50, $60, and I have to charge, at least $100 for a spring. And, a lot of customers kind of have a hard time dealing with that part of it. If we can save their spring and we're in good shape, that's the best way. A lot of times, unless the watch is completely damaged or rusted, we can almost always save a 16 or an 18 size spring. Again, if you want it to be perfect, you're going to replace it, but it comes at a cost. These have T-ends, so we're going to get that T-end into the barrel. There's a little notch on the side, and if you have to, you can just go around again in a circle, and we're going to line that up. And once we get there, I'm going to use a small screwdriver to hold it in position within the little notch for the T-end of the mainspring. Once that's in, I'll push the mainspring winder down, and that'll seat the spring into the barrel in the correct position. Now from there we can just kind of lubricate the watch spring. I'm using a little bit of general purpose oil here, nothing fancy. I don't always like using grease because if the customer does not wind the watch often, the grease will seize up long before this general purpose oil will. So typically, today's world, most people don't wind their pocket watches more than once or twice a year. You should wind them once a month just to keep them lubed up and running, but reality is different. We're going to stick the arbor in here, and we're going to make sure the arbor is seated correctly. If I have to make any adjustments to the spring or the mainspring barrel, this is the time to do it. Once we get that arbor in the right position and it's in the winding set, there's a little key there that'll catch the mainspring. Again, if you have to tighten it, this is how I tighten it. I'll either use a pair of spring pliers or my tweezers, depending on the mainspring. Get that seated correctly. We'll grab that arbor again. It's keyed one way, so if you know which way the spring winds within the barrel, your arbor is only going to go in one way from there. Once it's keyed in the correct position, we can go ahead and put the mainspring barrel cap on. And this barrel cap will just snap into place. Once in a while, I'll get a cap that is worn out. In some cases, we can use a staking set just to tamp them down and make them just a little bit larger so they snap into place. Yeah, we got a little fuzz in there we got to get rid of, but we're going to set this up. It's keyed. The main spring has that T end, so the top and the bottom of this barrel are keyed to fit on that T end or T-bar end. You can just put these down with hand pressure. Some people use like a nylon pair of parallel pliers. I typically only use those on gentle wristwatches or small pocket watches. You can use your fingers for the most part on anything larger than a 1 size or a 12 size. Let's go ahead and look at every gear on the train, and we're going to start assembling this. Now, there are many different ways to assemble your watch. On these 18 size watches, I typically start on the plate, the 3/4 bridge plate, and I keep that upside down. I work like this because this pallet fork, you really can't get it lined up if you're working on the full bridge or the frame of the watch. So you're really going to have to just kind of find out what works for you. This is what works for me. I assemble them upside down, and I get these gears in place. I'll seat every pinion in its corresponding jewel and make sure that everything's lined up and ready to go. In some cases, I'll put a little oil on there, and that oil just kind of keeps a little bit of tension on the parts to keep them from popping out. But this is really tricky, especially with these older pieces and these larger watches, because the pieces are heavy and they're going to move around. This is the escapement wheel, and you can see here, we're going to just line that up. It's taking me a little time here. I'm usually faster than this. And once it's seated, we can move on to the next one. Now, this particular gear has the pinion for the second hand. So this would be the third wheel, and we're going to get that set up. Now, we're working upside down, so again, the dial would be, on top of this. So the pinion is actually poking through. And again, you're just going to have to work your way around and make sure that you've got every gear lined up correctly in the right position so that nothing is in, a position where it's going to get damaged. And again, I'm working with a camera in front of my face. It's a little harder to line these up. It's always fun to do. And now we're going to move on to the main wheel. Well, let's get that second wheel out of there. Yeah, we got to get the main wheel on here. There we go. Now back to the second wheel, and we're just going to kind of line that up. That works. Now we can grab the watch frame, the movement frame, and we can start gently putting it on top of these gears. And we're going to be very careful because we don't want to damage any of those gears. Everything needs to line up. So you're going to look at where the winding system lines up. And of course, on this particular watch, it's keyed. You can see that little groove in the watch frame there, that plate lines up and corresponds to the winding system. Start with the main wheel, and we're going to poke its pinion through, and this is the part that actuates the minute hand, so we're gently put that through. Next thing we got to worry about is where the second hand pokes through, where the third wheel pinion pokes through. So we have to seat that through its jewel. And again, you're going to be very, very, very careful, making little minor adjustments to this until you poke that through. And what I typically do, I'm trying to show you this, but what I typically do is I'll take this under the microscope, and it takes me usually about 20 seconds to line this up. Here, I've got to tinker with it because I'm not working under a microscope. But the first time you do this, you just want to be very, very careful. Once you start getting the gears all lined up, they're going to fall into place, and then you can make little minor changes to them if they're not seated correctly before you even think about screwing these plates together. These old watches, always amazed me. I mean, here we are, it's 2025. This watch was made over 100 years ago. And the darn thing works just like it was brand new. It's just, it's engineering from that particular time frame is just phenomenal. So you can see I've got all the gears lined up, and we're going to put the 2 case screws that hold the 3/4 bridge in place. We're going to put those back in so it's holding everything. Again, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put them in. I'm not going to tighten them down unless I'm absolutely positive everything is seated correctly. And I'm just going to go ahead and back to the microscope, and I'm going to double check, make sure everything is lined up correctly. If it is, we'll just tighten these screws in place and move on. The corresponding correct screwdriver for each of these, you're pretty much going to go like 80% of the width of the screw should be your head for the screwdriver. And if you don't have a good set of screwdrivers, I'll put a link below where you can get them. And I'm just giving this a quick test. I'm putting a little pressure on the main wheel just to make sure that all the gears move freely, and they should move very, very easily at this point. There's no pressure on the system. So once we're happy with that, go ahead and put that last bridge screw in place. Tighten it up. And again, you don't have to, bully these. Just hand tighten them. If you just, it's not a car engine, so you're not going to tighten these down with 30 pounds of torque. This is, delicate pieces made of brass and older steel. These screws can be brittle sometimes, so you just want to use caution when you're tightening things down. Again, I'm going to check everything, make sure that everything moves and is seated correctly. With that done, now we're going to move on to the mainspring and the mainspring barrel, and we're going to get that in position. This will slide in. The one edge of it will fit into that ratchet wheel, and this is keyed with a square shape. So you're going to lock that into position. And once you get that barrel seated, and you're just going to see that square pop into place. Once that's done, we can put the bridge on for the mainspring. This should go on relatively easy. Once they're cleaned and there's no debris on these, typically they fit together really nicely. There should be 2 screws that hold any of these bridges on. I see this with, Howard, Illinois, Elgin, Waltham, South Bend. Pretty much, if you had an 18 size full bridge watch, there was always a plate with 2 screws on it that held the mainspring in position. In some cases, older watches from the mid to moderately late 1800s might have had a full bridge where you had to disassemble the whole watch to get the mainspring out, which, in itself could be, arduous for taking apart and cleaning. A lot of inexpensive, cheap Swiss watches up until the 1930s were kind of built like that. Hard to get parts. They fight you when you're trying to clean them. So here you can see I'm winding the mainspring. I'm just giving it a little bit of a wind, and you can see the ratchet holds it in place. So when I push down on the crown, I'm going to get the watch into a winding position. I'll turn that crown, and it'll wind the mainspring. That's the setting position, and that's the winding position. That click holds the spring in place so it doesn't unwind on its own. This watch does have a safety pinion, so the main gear does have a screwed-on gear for the pinion. If the spring does let loose, it'll unwind itself. Okay, so you can see I'm putting a little bit of oil on all the exposed jewels and pinions, and I'm just getting ready to give this a little bit of a test. This is about the part where I typically go through in my routine just to oil everything up before I do my final assembly. Now, the oilers that you use are going to be really dependent on the size of the pinions and jewels. You want to make sure there's enough lubrication on those pinion points, but not too much. You don't want to attract dirt or debris inside these watches. These watches, again, are not dust proof. They're going to have a lot of exposed areas where debris can get inside of them if they're not really well taken care of. Again, they're not waterproof or even water resistant, so try to avoid water at all costs. Here you can see I'm putting on the Cannon pinion. The Cannon pinion is the gear that holds the minute hand. Again, this will rotate once every hour. And I'm just testing again to make sure that everything is setting and winding as I go along. I like to test everything as I put things together. If you have a little issue, you know, every time you stop and do a test, you're going to find that problem, fix it, and then move on. What do we got here? Oh, I need a watch. Really what I need here is a dial washer. I'm going to look for a dial washer that fits. And I'm going to test a few just to make sure they fit. Once I find one that fits, we'll put that on the watch when we go ahead and put the dial on. And now this is the balance cock. We're going to do the upper jewel set. We're going to put that in place. You can see I'm using this foam pad, and I know a lot of you have said, oh, the foam pad's in rough shape. Well, you know what? It doesn't have any debris that falls off of it. All these little cuts I've put in place, just using a little knife to just make it easier for me to work in certain positions and with parts in a certain position. We're going to go ahead and put the whole jewel in. And again, that goes in one way. Some of these go in easier than others. In this case, I'm just going to use my tweezers to push that down. I can apply pressure on the pad and not cause any problems. Once that whole jewel is in place, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of oil in there, and then we'll seat the cap jewel onto the balance cock. Now, I've gotten very lucky with this particular watch. It had no broken jewels. The damage was pretty much to the case. The case was pretty, worn out. The bezel was dented and bent, so I had a little bit of work to do on the bezel, but the frame itself was good. The watch movement itself, besides being completely dried up and old dirty grease and oil had seized this watch up, I got pretty lucky here. So once everything was cleaned, again, you can see here I'm aligning these little 2 indents for the screws to hold this in place onto the balance cock. Once I get those lined up, I'll go ahead and put the 2 screws back in here. They have a little bit of wear on the threads, but not enough that I have to actually rethread them. These screws are really small, as you can see, and we're going to go ahead and get them stuck in there. We'll take our small screwdriver, tighten those up. Again, that cap jewel is keyed, so it can only go in one of 2 positions. And that's just to make sure we can use these 2 screws to lock it in place. What you'll typically see on balanced jewels now are little brass springs that hold them into a keyed position. Probably not cost effective to make those parts 150 years ago, so this was the more common way of doing it. And you'll find this mostly in watches made prior to the 1940s. This was almost always how they were done. Some of the Swiss watches, the cheaper Swiss imports, those were, to be honest with you, Swiss watches before the 1930s were kind of like Chinese watches today. They would have press fit jewels into the balance cock on both the upper and lower sides, and they were typically not replaceable. If you drop the watch, one of those jewels broke, well, you'd kind of throw it out and get yourself a new watch. I'm loosening up that collet screw for the hairspring. Gone ahead and I've cleaned the balance, cleaned the hairspring, put that all back together again, and we're going to line it up in the proper way, get that all seated correctly. And again, because that hairspring is so delicate, you've got to be really cautious and careful not to do any damage. Also, the hairspring has to fit into a little pair of forks on the balance adjustment for the speed of the watch. It's a micro adjustment. So you're going to line that up very carefully. It takes a little practice. And once you get that in there, you'll see how well it goes. If you really study your watch before you take it apart, when you put it back together, you'll understand completely how it goes back and gets all lined up. Once that collet is in place, we're just going to make sure that the hairspring, the final wind of the hairspring or the end of the hairspring towards the collet gets kind of locked in position with the forks of the adjustment. And just carefully, don't want to bend this. You got to be very delicate with this piece. Put that inside the forks, and that is your speed adjustment. The shorter the hairspring, the faster the watch runs. The longer the hairspring, the slower it will run. Once that's in position, we can go ahead and tighten up that collet screw to hold everything in position. And I apologize. Again, I'm working with a camera in front of my face, so I'm kind of looking over the camera, trying to film this to give you a better idea of how that goes in. Okay, so on to everyone's favorite part, getting that balance seated into the watch movement. And what we want to do is line it up with the pallet fork to make sure that it's going to seat correctly. And sometimes you get it in the wrong position. You can just pick up that balance very gently and align it correctly with the pallet fork. Once you do that, if you've got any wind on the mainspring, you should see that balance start swinging back and forth. That's the thank God moment. You know the watch is going to work good. And if we have to make any other adjustments to this, we can do it once this is seated in place. I'm going to put the screw down for the balance, and we're going to tighten that up. I'm going to do this very slowly and carefully so as not to put any pressure on the balance staff or the upper or lower jewel set, because we A, don't want to break the balance staff, and B, don't want to crack any of those jewels. This watch is all original, and we want to keep it that way. And there you go. It's working pretty good. I'm going to look at this in every possible position. This watch is not so sophisticated that it needs to be adjusted in 5 positions. It's usually adjusted in 3, face up, face down, and sideways, and we will go ahead and test it in those particular positions. Okay, so I've got the stem and the crown back in the watch case. The case has been cleaned and polished, so we're going to get the movement seated back into the frame. A little bit of finagling here. I don't put the hands on an open face watch until I've gotten the movement seated correctly into the watch frame. So we're going to put the first case screw in. We're going to tighten that down. And we'll get the second case screw. Now remember, this had a broken case screw, so we had to go find another one that fit. So I was able to find one that fit, and we're going to tighten both of these in position, which holds the movement onto the frame and will seat it correctly without it slipping or rotating within the case. We still use case screws today in most watches. They kind of work the same way. They're going to put a little pressure from the movement onto the frame to hold it in position. Put a little bit of pressure on those screws to hold them in place, and we'll rotate this over. We're going to flip it, and we're going to check out the upper side, make sure everything works good. Then typically I'll put the back cover on to put the hands on, and here you can see I've got the back cover on the watch. That way I'm not going to damage the balance on the underside as I'm working on the watch. And here I've already seated the second hand. I've cleaned the dial as best I can. Now, unfortunately, these cracks are so hairline, I wasn't able to get, even with a steam cleaner, I couldn't get any of the debris out of those cracks. A lot of times, if you have a cracked dial, if you use certain kinds of different cleaning methods, you can get most of those little lines out of the case. Now, this watch did not come in with hands, so we're kind of stuck here. We got to find a good set of hands, and this is what I'm doing now. I've got new old stock hands as well as brand new pocket watch hands, and we're going to go through and just try to find a set that matches the style of the watch and that fits the hour wheel as well as the cannon pinion so the watch works good. Unlike today's modern watches, we don't have diagrams or engineering diagrams that show us the diameter or the sizes of the hour and minute hand. So most of these watches you're going to do like trial and error. You can still get some vendors who still sell pocket watch hands in lots. And I have literally thousands of pocket watch hands, both new and new old stock. And we're just going to go through until we find stuff that fits. And you'll also find that in some cases you have to make adjustments to the hands so that they fit tightly onto the watch. Here you can see I'm using a hand tool just to seat the minute hand correctly. I'm going to wiggle that on there until it's tight. And then I'll do a test and make sure that the hands don't rub against each other, that we don't want the hour hand to rub against the second hand, nor the minute to rub against the hour hand. Go around in a full turn, and we'll just set the watch at whatever current time it is. I like to make sure everything's lined up at the 12 o'clock position just to make sure that the hands are in good shape. You can see I'm also blowing off any dust or debris while I'm working on that. And if we have to tighten that second hand down, we can do it now. Now this hand is a little bit loose, so I'll take a pair of crimpers and I'll just tighten the opening to make it a little bit tighter. Sorry about the shakiness here. It's kind of hard to work on front of a camera. And I'm just going to line that up and make sure that it's tight in two different directions. So when we put it back on that third wheel, it holds tight and won't flip around or fall off the watch. You also have to be careful because you don't want to bend this in any way and misalign the post, because you can do a little bit of damage to these hands if you're not careful. Once that's all tight, I'll go ahead and we'll just gently put that back onto that third wheel. And it should stay on nice and tightly. I'm going to twist this around until it's kind of seated perfectly level. Once in a while, you'll find on these old watches that the third wheel pinion might be a little bit off. And just finding that sweet spot to line that so that the hand doesn't rub against the dial, you can just kind of move that around. Here it is, it's tight and it's on, it's seated, and the watch is running. It's running pretty good. We're going to go ahead and time this as well. With that done, I've gone ahead and cleaned the crystal. I've epoxied the crystal onto the bezel. And here you can see I'm just going to start the reassembly process. This case has quite a bit of wear on it. And you can see I was turning that in reverse just to find the right thread key so that it's seated correctly. And now I'm going to go ahead and just check everything and make sure the hands don't rub against each other now, as well as not rubbing against the crystal, which could actually slow down the watch movement. We're going to give it a quick winding test, make sure that everything works good. We know it sets well, and everything's lined up correctly. Again, if I were going to do a full restoration on this, if the watch was, a movement that was much more valuable, I'd probably put it in a new old stock case or a case that was in really good shape. Or if the customer really wanted this restored as much as possible, we'd go plate it just to fill in those brass spots. Here you can see the watch. It's running good. I've tested it on the timer. It's running plus. This watch actually plus or minus about 3 seconds a day. The spring is in good shape, so obviously it was replaced within the last 40 or 50 years, and it tempered really well. I think the customer is going to be happy with this working watch. I think they want to give it to their grandson for a wedding gift, something that was handed down in the family. I think this has been around for 4 or 5 generations. So one watch, one family, and just about completely restored. If the customer winds this watch several times a year, it should keep running for another 30, 40 years. So guys, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to my channel. It does help the algorithm and it gets me more views. All those views help me. I appreciate you watching to this point, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below or send me a DM. Again, if you're looking for the parts or tools that I used in this video, I'll try to link all of those in the description or on the YouTube channel page. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.